4 events that we're having in the Walton Lecture Series this year. As always, let's express our appreciation to Jack and Janet Walton for generously sponsoring this event. Our final event after tonight is going to be on April 21st. We have John Cottingham coming in to consider the question of whether a scientific worldview rules out a place for the mystical or the sacred. Tonight, though, we're going to consider, we're going to stage, as it were, a quasi-debate. My good friend Howard Robinson and I say quasi because a true philosophical debate would get us involved. We have talked about this a lot. And if we were to have like a real philosophical debate, it would get very technical, very fast. But the goal of the Walton Lecture Series is, of course, to reach a general audience. So we've talked about some things that we're going to cover, some things that we're going to avoid talking about because they're too technical, and we're hoping to be able to present the main points so that people get a sense for the main positions of the debate and the main moves to make. So with that, I will hand it over to Howard Robinson.
Bill, thanks for coming. If you have difficulty hearing me, say so, and I'll put this machinery on. I don't think it will be necessary. I hope not. As you see, the title is Embodied Spirits or Spiritual Bodies. Now, what's that driving at? Is the human being something more than a very wonderful physical structure? More than matter organized in a fantastically complex way? The claim that we're embodied spirits is that we are more than fantastically well-organized, complicated material structures. So I will be arguing that a human being is more than such a structure. A human being has a body and needs a body to be complete. But it's a spirit as well as a body. And human identity is clearly tied up with the identity of that spirit. So I shall be arguing. There's nothing that I shall say which is not hyper-controversial and disputed by lots of people, not just Bill. But I shall, of course, try to state it as the obvious truth. But don't be deceived. I believe that this can be shown that we are embodied spirits by philosophical argument consistently with science. And this view is the one most consonant, I'm claiming, with Christian doctrine. What I'm going to claim to begin with is that neither consciousness nor thought are physical states or physical activities. And these are our most defining characteristics. They are the core of what it is to have or be a rational soul, which is what it is to be human. So I want to look at, first of all, a famous argument for the view that consciousness is not a physical phenomenon, and then look at some other arguments that thinking is not a physical phenomenon either. And with those two together, we'll have the spirit, which is going to be, as it were, embodied, the spiritual side of things. You might wonder why I don't mention the moral side of human nature, but of course that depends on consciousness and thought. You can't have ethics without rationality, and so that's to be, as it were, swept up in the things that I'm talking about. Well, I want to begin by discussing an argument which goes back to Leibniz, but has received a great fillip in the last few years, mainly through articles by the Australian philosopher Frank Jackson. Australia is the home, as some of you may know, of central state materialism, into which Frank has now lapsed back. But for a little while he was the rebel against the national cause, and he propounded this following argument, that consciousness cannot be a physical state. This was in 1982. I put forward a similar argument at about the same time, but lots of people had played with the same idea. Now his picture, yeah, here we are. Frank Jackson imagined somebody we call Mary, who had been locked in this room where she was unable to, not allowed to see any chromatic colours. It's difficult to see how that could be contrived. She would never see a local blood or anything of that kind. But never mind. This is a thought experiment. I'm going to say something about it in a minute. But she was tremendously well educated in science. And she knew everything there was to know about the process of seeing as it belonged to light waves, to the optical centres, to the human brain, understood either in neurology or, if you like, in quantum theory, if you think you can get that far down, or in information processing. She knew all those things, but if she'd never seen a colour, she wouldn't know what it was like to see red. If she knew all the physical stuff, and there's something that she didn't know, what she didn't know can't be a physical fact. And that's the fact about the nature of consciousness. The case I considered at roughly the same time as a chap I called the deaf scientist, somebody born stone deaf, and then who learnt all the science of hearing, but had never heard a sound. He wouldn't know what it was like to hear. The point is the same in both cases. You can have all the physical information you like, and if you don't have the experience, if you don't have the conscious state in question, you don't know what that conscious state is like. So a conscious state can't be something captured in the physical account, in the scientific account. And that's an argument for what gets called property dualism. Now, there are lots of responses to this argument. And I've just submitted a book which has 8 chapters discussing it, or at least 6 of the 8 are discussing it. In my view, none of the responses works. The most common kind of response is to say, well, when Mary leaves her room and sees colours for the first time, she doesn't learn any new facts. She just starts to do things that she couldn't do before. But it's not any new information, any new fact that she learned. That just doesn't seem to be right. Imagine the deaf scientist never heard anything, knew all the science of hearing, neurology, sound waves, put it all together, and suddenly he gets his hearing. He's going to learn what something is like, the nature of conscious states. This doesn't only apply to strange things like colour experiences. We know the science of what 4, 5, 6, 10 dimensional spaces are like. I mean, people who can do the maths of that kind of thing. Nobody's any faintest idea what such a space would be like qualitatively. And if you read the story of Flatland, it came out in the 1890s, I think, well, somebody imagined people who lived in 2 dimensions, they wouldn't know what 3 dimensions was like. You can know the theory, unless you have the experience, you don't really know what the thing is like. So the conscious state escapes the account of physical science. It escapes the third personal point of view. And science is all about the view from nowhere, the third personal point of view. Well, that's the argument for thinking that consciousness is not a physical phenomenon. Of course, it may depend on the brain. You do something to the brain, you have a conscious state. There's a causal connection. Even Descartes, the great dualist, believed that. It's also true that consciousness is very closely tied up with who we are, with our identity as a human being. If you were never going to be conscious again, you might as well have ceased to exist. If you kept behaving robotically as if you were conscious, if you're not having any of the experiences, then for you it's the end. So there's a sense in which you're identified with your consciousness, particularly if you include thinking along with it. Okay, thinking. Why is thinking not a physical state or process? Descartes, in the 17th century, thought that thinking couldn't be physical because it was too complicated, too complex an operation for any machine to do it. At least that's one way of understanding what he said. And people nowadays tend to say, but computers now, they're really complicated things. And they can do all these calculations, they can play chess, they can even recognize faces. So we now have machines that in principle can do all the things that a thinking person can do. That's not true. And that it's not true is something that's defended by some of the philosophers who are most interested in that kind of cognitive science. There's a distinguished professor of linguistics at Rutgers called Mark Baker. Now Mark, to together with Stephen Gertz, edited a book which I strongly recommend called The Soul Hypothesis. But in that and in other articles that he's written in hardline scientific journals and in a Cambridge collection on the nature of concepts, he points out that Noam Chomsky, now Chomsky lies behind a lot of this computational theory of the mind, because it was his notion of how language works, how it's in innate structures which manipulate words according to grammar, that really gave rise to a lot of the thinking about the nature of computational thought. Jerry Fodor's notion of the language of thought, and that sort. But Chomsky makes it clear, and he's never changed his mind on this, there are three aspects to language use. Lexicon, the words, syntax, the grammar, and what he calls the creative aspects of language use, canon. And he says nothing that he says throws any light whatsoever on that. Now, Chomsky's closest philosophical pupil was Jerry Fodor. Most people, Fodor invented this notion of the language of thought, which is kind of brain writing, which in our thinking we compute with these symbols in the head. And for a long time, people just took it for granted that Fodor thought that this coped with everything. He then wrote a book called The Mind Doesn't Work That Way, in which he pointed out, he always said, that the computational approach only works for peripheral modular information processing, perception, handling memory, and that kind of stuff. It doesn't work at all for serious thought. So take the three components of what rational thought might be. Deduction. All humans are animals, all animals are mortal, therefore all humans are mortal. A machine can do that because it's of a purely syntactic, algebraic type of form. All A's are B, all B's are C, therefore all A's are C. You can make a machine that will do that. You can make a machine also which will do this. That's a white swan, that's a white swan, that's a white swan, that's a white swan, that's a white swan. So the next one's probably white. What you can't get a machine to do is abduction. Fodor makes this strongly, Baker agrees with it, Chomsky agrees with it. What is the cause of cancer? Well, there are four hypotheses. Which one works best? There's no machine way of working out something like that. Why not? Why is it that you can't work out things like that using strictly machine, as it were, mechanical ways? Well, this brings us to an argument that came up in the early 80s, which was both very influential and rather despised by some of the more bien-pensant fashionable philosophers, namely Searle's Chinese room argument. Now, Searle's argument was this. Supposing you were to put John Searle, who speaks English and no Chinese, into a room with a book of instructions. The instructions tell him what to do when a symbol of a certain sort comes through on one side, and what he's to do to put out a symbol at the other side. The book of instructions is in fact a Chinese grammar. What's coming in are Chinese symbols. So he's told how to manipulate these things and put them out. He's doing just what a computer does. Taking symbols, manipulating those symbols according to rules, and doing an output. He doesn't understand a word of what he's doing. That is not understanding, according to Searle. And he's quite right. Understanding is not a purely syntactic process. We are not, Daniel says, any materialist has to believe we are purely syntactic engines, i.e., we work like a formal system, or really just a physical system. It shapes in holes, like an old-fashioned computer was. It shapes in holes, or charges, electric charges doing this, that, and the other. It involves no understanding. Searle's argument shows that that's not what it is to understand. There's something more. We are what Dennett says we're not, semantic engines. Engines that work from meaning. So when Bill stands up in a few minutes and replies to what I'm saying, it's not just a question of what my sound waves are doing in his brain, making other sound waves come down. He'll reply to what he thinks I meant. And it's the meaning of it that's driving this engine. Now, you need the grammar, you need the syntax. One of the peculiar things of embodiment, you can't do without it. But it's not the whole story. And this shows that, I think, that understanding thought, understanding the thing that Stephen Grimmer's got his all this money from Templeton to investigate, see there is really something to investigate. computational process. Understanding is not a physical process either. So there are also other well-known problems, the frame problem, the halting problem, Gödel's proof, all of which show that the process of understanding escapes the kind of formalization that either mathematics or computer science can give you. There is more to it, and that's important. So if you put together the fact you can't have a materialist account of consciousness, you can't have a materialist account of thought or understanding, and how central those two things are to our being as agents, to our being as morally responsible beings, you can see that the you that is you, though it has a body, it needs a body, if you lose your body, you're in a mess. You need your body, as it were, to store your memories and to give you the information through the senses. But the core of the inner activity is not physical. Now, this is important, I think, from the Christian perspective. We believe in the resurrection of the body, and according to traditional doctrine, you need the body. You're not a complete image of God without it. I've got views on why you need the body to be the complete image of God. I think it mirrors his infinity, because we can store more in that way. Can I have another 5 minutes? Is that possible? Yeah. Just a bracket. If you look at Ariel in The Tempest, Ariel is pure spirit. Ariel can do what he's told or she's told. There's no more to Ariel than what's in the consciousness. A disembodied spirit of a finite soul, all the shops in the window, all the goods are in the window. And that puts a certain kind of limitation on what it can be like. Angels are like that in a sense. They do what they're messengers. They are their job. Somehow what embodiment allows us to be is to have enormous reserves that are not in the window. Things that we're not conscious of at the time, but which we can draw. That's what I think is the importance of embodiment, and it does give us more in the image of something that's infinite than if it were just the conscious show. But that's just an aside. It's because we are spirits in bodies that you can make sense of the resurrection. Otherwise, our body decays, we go back to dust. Those bits of dust get into other people's bodies as well. I mean, nobody's body is unique to them if you're thinking of it in terms of the physical part. So if there was nothing more to you than your body, all God could do would be create a replica and put something together, rather like that man Robinson was. Now, that's not the resurrection of me. That's like getting, there's all this problem about Doctor Who. I missed the first episode of Doctor Who in 1970, well, I watched the rest of it for quite a few years, but I haven't over the last 20. No, it's not Doctor Who, it's Star Trek, sorry, beaming down. You get beamed down. Now, if what's happening in beaming down is they turn your matter into energy and send it down and reconstruct it, that's okay. If they just read your structure, obliterate you and build something else at the other end, then it's just a duplicate. The resurrection is not like being beamed down by Dr. Spock. What was it, Dr. Spock? It was Scotsman, wasn't it? There's got to be a genuine principle of continuity. I mean, the Scotsman that I watched in the 60s is probably something completely different. There's got to be a genuine principle of continuity if there's going to be the resurrection of you. Now, Bill's got the answer to that, and I don't give you the answer, so we're going to have a back and forth a bit later on these points. But those are my reasons, anyway. We're an embodied spirit because consciousness is not a physical phenomenon, thought is not a physical phenomenon. Those are the core of our being. We need a body to be completed, and we need that spiritual element to continue in some sense or other in order to be there, as it were, us at the resurrection.
Thanks, Howard. So let me just start out by explaining what I'm concerned to defend. So the original thing is embodied spirits or spiritual bodies. So Howard's taken a position that we're spirits that happen to be embodied. But there's another position that says, well, fundamentally we're bodies, but we're spiritual beings. Sort of the spirituality is what distinguishes us from other bodily beings. So I'm concerned with establishing the compatibility of traditional Jewish and Christian doctrines, eschatological doctrines, resurrection in particular, with the claim that we're human beings. Now, human being is going to be a tricky term because Howard and I are actually going to differ on what exactly a human being is. So I have a very rigorous and austere conception of what a human being is. So it's the kind of conception that, for instance, Abraham has in the book of Genesis when he is pleading with God not to destroy all these people. He says, "See, Lord, how I am presuming to speak, though I am but dust and ashes." That's the kind of view that I think I'm concerned to reconcile with Jewish and Christian doctrine. Why? Well, because I think the best scientific account of what we are shows that we're human animals of the members of the animal species Homo sapiens, who have evolved by a process of natural selection, and who are composed of the same kinds of physical materials that compose dogs, trees, tables, and chairs. And you might think, wow, that's a really austere view of human beings. It's just like the kind of picture that bare science would give us. I say, yes. And guess what? That conception is perfectly compatible with Orthodox Jewish and Christian doctrines, including the doctrine of the resurrection. Now, having said a little bit about what it means to claim that we're a human being, or how I understand that, let me say a couple words about what I understand to be the case about these traditional Jewish and Christian doctrines, because I realize there's a great deal of confusion about those. I'm only going to say a little bit because there are actually members of our audience who are more competent to speak on those things than I am. Scott there is actually a theologian who specializes in this kind of stuff. So I'm going to say less because the less I say, the less likely I am to be wrong about this. But later on you can tell me, Scott, if I'm exaggerating the profound bodiliness of the traditional view. So a lot of people have a view that suppose, whether they're Christian or not, they think that the Orthodox Christian view is one that says that we are sort of, we're these sort of disembodied things, or that we will be disembodied. We're sort of ghostly beings that inhabit a body, and we die and that sort of floats away and goes to heaven, or goes down and goes to hell, or whatever. But people who study this stuff apparently say, well, that's really not the case. So here's a quote from the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright. "The New Testament is deeply, deeply Jewish, and the Jews had for some time been intuiting a final physical resurrection. They believe that the world of space and time and matter is messed up but remains basically good, and God will eventually sort it out and put it right again. Belief in that goodness is absolutely essential to Christianity. But Greek-speaking Christians, influenced by Plato, saw our cosmos as shabby and misshapen and full of lies, and the idea was not to make it right, but to escape it and leave behind our material bodies. The church at its best has always come back toward the Hebrew view, but there have been times when the Greek view was very influential. Two obvious historical examples are Dante's great poetry, which sets up a heaven, purgatory, and hell immediately after death, and Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, which portrays heaven and hell as equal and opposite last destinations. Both had enormous influence on Western culture, so much so that many Christians think that is Christianity. But never at any point do the Gospels or Paul say that Jesus has been raised, therefore we are all going to heaven. They all say Jesus is raised, therefore the new creation has begun, and we have a job to do." Now, what Wright alludes to here is the idea that there's this alternative model of understanding the Jewish and Christian endgame, one that sees us as essentially bodily beings. Wright is not the first one to have had this idea. It is a very old idea, and he's shared in this conception of things by many others. There's another New Testament scholar, Oscar Coleman. If we were to ask an ordinary Christian today what he conceived to be the New Testament teaching concerning the fate of man after death, with few exceptions, we should get the answer: the immortality of the soul. Yet, this widely accepted idea is one of the greatest misunderstandings of Christianity. There is no point in attempting to hide this fact, or to veil it by reinterpreting the Christian faith. The concept of death and resurrection is anchored in the Christ event. and hence is incompatible with the Greek belief in immortality. Now you might ask, well, is this some newfangled liberal theology that Wright and Coleman are espousing? Well, no, in point of fact, if you look back, whoops, what happened? If you look back, there's a slide that's supposed to be in there. You find church fathers, early church fathers. So the 2nd century church father Tatian, pupil of Justin Martyr, argues, he's dialoguing with these Greek philosophers, the soul is not in itself immortal, O Greeks, but mortal. Likewise, consider the Apostles' Creed. Consider the Nicene Creed. I believe in the resurrection of the dead. I believe in the resurrection of the body. You will not find any statement in those about, I believe in the immortality of the soul. What all of these authors point to is the idea that that notion of immortality of the soul is sort of a Greek import that is foreign to the sort of native Hebrew soil in which the notion of resurrection first grew. So, as I understand it then, as I understand these guys, and I'm sure our resident theologians will correct me later, but the view of resurrection is one of an entire transformation of the physical universe. And our resurrection is just part of that transformation. So God starts out the universe, but God gives the universe a certain degree of autonomy. Our free will is just one expression of that. And so the universe can take its own path, including a path that goes against God's original plan. But rather than enforcing his will on that universe, God decides instead to sort of persuade the universe to accord with his will. And so in the fullness of time, the universe is going to sort of accord with God's will. How does God persuade the universe? By establishing relationships with its inhabitants through Moses and the prophets, and on the Christian version of the story, by actually becoming part of that physical universe. And so the universe is transformed from the inside out. And so what Coleman calls that Christ event, the death and resurrection of the Christ, that's what Paul calls just the first fruits of this overall transformation that will culminate ultimately in a new heaven and a new earth in which we are brought back as bodily beings. So that, I take it, is going to be that's the doctrine of resurrection as I understand it. And so my claim is that this notion of resurrection can be reconciled with the view that we are human beings, human animals, of exactly the sort that's described by our best science. Why should we believe that this is the case? Well, on this point, my sense is that our default view is going to be one according to which we're human beings. For the most part, you probably think of yourself as a human being. If you've ever really worried about it, philosophers actually have a very straightforward argument that you're a human being. It goes something like this. You are the only individual seated in your chair. There's a human being seated in your chair. Hence, you've got to be that human being. Now, there are philosophers who reject one of those premises or the other. But if you're not like those philosophers, you're probably on board with the idea that you're a human being. So, are there good reasons to reject the idea that we're human beings, or to reject the idea that we have to be something other than human beings in this sense to endorse Jewish and Christian views on this stuff? So, with that, I'll turn to Howard's arguments. So, Howard's first argument, the arguments, the knowledge argument, the Chinese room, the discussion he had about Fodor, what those arguments, if they're successful, we'll put that to one side, let's just assume that they are, what those arguments establish is that consciousness and thought, these mental phenomena, are not physical phenomena. Now, of course, that by itself isn't enough to tell us that we're non-physical beings. It's not enough to tell us that we've got some sort of non-physical part. Why? Well, because the very same individual can have different properties, different characteristics. The same apple can be both red and round. It can have both a color and a shape. Likewise, You and I, the very same individual, can have both physical properties and mental properties. There's nothing incompatible about numerically one individual having different properties or characteristics. So even if we were to concede that thought, consciousness, mental phenomena in general are not physical, they can't be described by physics, physics misses something about them, that wouldn't show that we're non-physical beings. It wouldn't show that we have a non-physical part. Now, Howard suggests that we need a part in order to, a sort of non-physical part, to account for resurrection. And the reason why we need that, is that if God just sort of, so here's the idea, you're alive, you die, the physical materials that compose you get scattered throughout the biosphere, and then God reassembles these. But if it's just this reassembly, what's to prevent that from being a duplicate of you? Resurrection is supposed to ensure that you are the one who's brought back into existence. You're the one who's raised from the dead. If it's not you, then the promise of resurrection is not such a great promise anyway. It's like promising somebody else that they'll get a good thing. It's just a very different thing. So in order to ensure that this is really you and not just a duplicate of you, Howard argues that we need to include some sort of non-physical part that continues to exist throughout the process. So you have a non-physical part, and once all these particles get scattered through the biosphere or whatever, that part persists, and when it's reattached to the rest of the stuff, that ensures that this is you. Now, the difficulty with this line of argument is that this isn't the only way that you could ensure that this is in fact you. So Howard mentioned, we have different views on this. Let me describe a couple of the alternatives. Another alternative says that you have not a non-physical part that survives your death and that ensures that this is you, but just a plain old physical part. So suppose that there is some unique physical part that only you have, and that that's able to survive your death. And then, by putting that back into the rest, that ensures that that individual is you and no other. So that would also ensure that that is uniquely you. Here's another view. So Howard mentioned physical materials with a complex structure. So one view, this is the view that was held by Aquinas, is that you've got this structure. It makes you the kind of thing you are. It's what confers on you the distinctive kinds of capacities you have. But the thing about the kind of structure that you have is that it can survive being disembodied. That is, even though you die, you cease to be, that structure can still exist, can still survive. And given that it has that special characteristic of being able to survive that, when you reunite it, when it structures again these materials, that ensures that that is you. And then there's a fourth view. And it's a very simple view. So it says this: what makes you the unique individual you are is that you stand in a special relationship to God. So some people say that they're defined by their relationship to their spouse, or they're defined by their relationship to their children, or they're defined by their relationships to some institution or to other people or something like that. And so this view says, well, yeah, maybe we are in some sense defined by our relationship to God. So there's this doctrine that God loves each human individual uniquely, not as the member of some general kind like human or intelligent or rational, but rather as this unique individual. That when God wills that you exist, God doesn't just will that some human exists, God wills that you individually, this special person, exists. Now suppose that makes you, that act of creation, that act of willing, is what makes you the unique individual you are. Then, after you die, God wills, at the resurrection, that an individual that has that unique characteristic exists. since you are the only individual who has that characteristic, who could have that characteristic, that ensures that it is you who come back into existence. So there are a number of views, and by the way, there is one more I should mention. It's a well-known view. It's Paul's view. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 actually brings up this. Someone will say, how are the dead raised? You fool! God gives a body just as he wishes. You might think, well, that's a bit short. But the important point is this. A Jew or Christian who's convinced that he or she is a human in the way that I've described could very well take a view like Paul's and say, okay, I'm convinced that I'm a human. I'm convinced that there's going to be a general resurrection. How is that supposed to work? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a tech person. God's good at that stuff. I'm sure God has it sorted out. So that's a position as well. So there are a variety of positions. The kind of position that Howard's been describing, or that Howard likes, is not the only one. Now, given that that's the case, it's not by itself sufficient to say, oh, well, you know, we have to have this in order to ensure that this is us. There are other ways in which a Jew or a Christian can say, oh yeah, here's why it's me. It doesn't have to be a non-physical part. It could be a unique physical part. It could be a structure that can survive somebody's death. It can be just a unique relationship in which this human stands to God. And any one of these could provide the resources for ensuring that it is you who was raised from the dead and not a mere duplicate. Okay, so with that, I'll hand it back to Howard.
Very much, Bill. There's at least two major points that Bill is insisting on. One is that this what gets called dualistic picture is a Greek and Platonistic picture, not a Christian one. And the other is that there are other ways of dealing with, so to speak, the notion of resurrection and of the body. Just on the last thing he put on, where Paul says God can give a body to who he wants, what's he giving it to? He didn't say God can make a body to obey whoever he wants. He said God can give a body to whoever he wants. There's something that is being given to him, it seems to me. Anyway. Now the question of what was, just like Bill, I'm not an expert on the Old or New Testament context. It is interesting that St. Paul says at one point that he was wrapped up into the seventh heaven, in his body or out of his body, he doesn't know. So he assumes that there is a way that he can be without his body. And even in the Old Testament, people talk about going down to Sheol. When is it, which of the kings is he going to die? He thinks this is going to happen to him. It happens in the Psalms as well. Now, I don't doubt that there's no particular great philosophical consistency here, because they didn't think in these terms, unlike the Greeks. And there was development through the Old Testament. Obviously, there's a point early on when it's not at all clear that they're totally monotheistic. They moved from thinking that their God's the best God, and then their God was the one who made everything, and then the others are not gods at all. There's a development of understanding. And they're not concentrating on this sort of problem, it seems to me. And when they do begin to think about it, well, there's obviously Athens and Jerusalem go together for these purposes. They're not at odds with each other. That's the wrong way of looking at it. There was an unfortunate remark that Pope Benedict made at one point, which caused offence, but was probably true, when he suggested that one of the problems with Islam is there was not much influence of Greek thought. It was more like the pure legalism of Judaistic thought, universalized, so to speak. Of course, there was a period when there was a lot of Islamic philosophy, but that was suppressed in the end for reasons that it's not relevant here to go on to. So I don't regard those arguments as conclusive. Now, when it comes to these other ways of surviving, it's very difficult would it be me just because God decided to have the towards Robinson attitude towards it? Well, that doesn't, I don't want to say that it's not possible, because to say what is not possible for God is a rather rash business. But I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. But I think I want to say, when it comes to the survival of structure, now, Bill said that was Aquinas' position. Well, it was Aquinas' position, but Aquinas thought that the structure, i.e. the form of the human being, could continue because it was associated with the individual intellect. He wouldn't have thought that the structure, i.e. the form of a dog, assuming dogs not to have this kind of intellect, could survive and then be re-embodied as the same form. So, the use of substantial form in this way by Aquinas is connected with Aquinas' Aristotelian dualism. And he wouldn't have thought that you could do without it, neither would Aristotle. And so, I'm not convinced of these other forms of survival, and I don't think it runs against the Judaistic tradition when it was thinking, so to speak. The time of Jesus, too, was a very Greek-Jewish time. Philo was around about that time. Now, he didn't have a lot of influence on Jewish thought, but it's even uncertain whether Jesus himself was Greek. Paul makes this remark about how all Cretans are liars, not realizing that this is a paradox and not an actual statement about Cretans. So we were in a world with lots of intellectual influences, actually working through the apostles and working, what we might think, in the mind of Jesus as well. In the human mind, in his divine mind, he'd already had these Greek thoughts, the true ones, that is, because that's where they came from. So, I'm not convinced by Bill's argument, and he's not convinced by mine. And if you've ever met any two philosophers going on, you'll find that's always the case. Philosophers are the only people who, when they say of an evening out, I had a really good argument with him, they mean they had a good time and got on with each other. Most people, it means they ended up having a fight. So, I'm not convinced. I hope you're not convinced that that's fine.
Okay, so let me say then a couple words about these alternatives. So Howard mentions here that Aquinas, his take on it, requires this Aristotelian metaphysic. I think that's true with the qualification. I think that Aquinas stretches the Aristotelian metaphysic to a breaking point. I think that in the end, in order to make it work out, he actually has to depart from Aristotelian metaphysics. And for that reason, the view can stand on its own. Now, in point of fact, I don't buy this view because I think that if you're going to make use of the notion of structure that can exist without something structured, I think that you might as well just give up the entire framework that talks about structure and stuff that's structured, and just go with what is philosophically a more elegant framework, something like you find in Descartes. And I think that I view Aquinas and Descartes as actually Janus figures. I think that Descartes has one face looking backward to Aristotle and one face looking forward to Descartes. I think Descartes has one face looking backward to Aquinas and one face looking forward to the current horror that is contemporary philosophy of mind. Now, for that reason, I'm with Howard. I don't think that this view ultimately works. I don't know what to think about this view. I know a lot of people find it really weird. I guess I find it pretty strange, but I actually don't know what to say against it. Let me say a little bit about the difficulty I have with this view. So, the difficulty I have with this view is that, and also, it's inherited by this view as well. These two views have the same kind of thing, and it's the thing that Howard brought out. That both of these views make it out that the most special thing about us, what really distinguishes us, what really makes us special, is going to be our intellectual capacities. Now, in this kind of context, if we're talking about God's creative act at work, if we're talking in a Jewish or Christian context in which, we're told God's eye is on the sparrow, God knows everything, God takes a personal interest in human faith, then that emphasis on our intellectual powers strikes me as being rather narrow. So, I think, for instance, of my daughter. Suppose that my daughter were born with some dread genetic disease which prevented her from ever developing cerebral hemispheres fully, so that she could never become psychologically endowed the way you and I are. She would never develop the ability to think or to feel or to act intentionally the way you and I have. Would that at all diminish her lovability relative to God? Would God, who willed that she exist uniquely, as per this view, suddenly say, ah, I guess she's no longer lovable? Or would rather the love of God persist despite that incapacity? I think there are Jewish and Christian reasons to think that God's love is going to endure forever, that God's love is going to endure no matter what happens to us psychologically, whether we're maimed, and let's face it, that could happen to us. We might lose our psychological capacities. Some really serious neural trauma could rob any one of us of the capacity to think or to feel or perceive or act. Would that diminish our special human dignity? Would it diminish what makes us special? Would it diminish our lovability by God? If the answer is no, if you think that God's love would endure no matter what, then the emphasis isn't going to be on those intellectual capacities, whether they're embodied in some sort of structure like this or belong to some sort of non-physical part. And in that sense, I think that this view, and somewhat strangely, this view, probably have the most going for them. So, I'll say that. Howard, you want to say something?
I just want to reply to the last point you made, really. There's a saying in English law, I don't know whether it applies in American law, that hard cases make bad law. Does it apply in American law?
Yeah.
Right. There's a tendency among philosophers to want necessary and sufficient conditions for things, and finding the hardest case is what's meant to refute a theory. The counter-example game, so to speak. Now, let's take the case of, say, somebody who miscarriages or is aborted or never develops as a human being in all kinds of ways. God does love them, and it's in the light of the kind of thing they are and how they should be like. Something that never could develop beyond that stage would not be the kind of thing that God would be loving in this way. So it's the central case that carries the issue. How you deal with the difficult case is another matter. One would hope, General de Gaulle said, I think, when his daughter died, who had been mentally handicapped, I can't remember what kind of way, but died at about 30, now she's like the rest. He didn't mean, now she's gone to dust, like everybody does. What he meant was, she'll be restored. And so it's the central case that carries our relationship with God. And what we hope in those people who don't get a chance because they're aborted or because they're terribly damaged is that somehow they'll become conscious beings, able to think in some sort of sense. I didn't stress the intellectual part, if that means the kind of things you do when you're a philosophy professor. Ordinary people are conscious and think. You don't have to be souped up to be doing the kind of things I was talking about. Descartes makes that point as well. Even the village idiot is a thinking being, so to speak. So I'm not convinced by that argument. I don't think one should be allowed to. Otherwise, I mean, if somebody got no further developed than as if he was a cat, then God ought to be resurrecting all the cats as well. Somebody told me that Pope Francis had suggested that animals might survive, but anyway, that's just an expression of universal love of some kind. So I'm not convinced by it. That's quite bad. Shall we answer questions now?
Let me just, as you started.
Okay, sorry.
So on the, and with this, after this, we can move on to Q&A. So with regard to that, yes, it's true, hard cases make bad law, and any philosopher is aware of all sorts of theories that are constructed on hard cases that make pretty bad theories. You know, hard cases make bad theories too. The thing is, though, what counts as the hard case also depends on which theory we're dealing with. So, in particular, on this kind of a view, the case in which I've described is not the hard case. In fact, it's not even exceptional. All the cases are exactly the same. In all these cases, an individual is uniquely loved by God, and it's that unique love that distinguishes this individual from every other. And so, in that sense, whether this person has certain kinds of psychological capacities or not, whether this person has been impaired in one way or another, irrespective of any of those characteristics, you still have the same unique making characteristic. And so this doesn't end up being a hard case, doesn't end up being exceptional in any sort of way. And it could be the case, I suppose, on this view as well, that this little physical component, whatever it happens to be, isn't affected by any of that stuff. It's just the same in everybody. So again, among all these views, it's strangely I say this one, I'm not sure what to think about it, other than I can't think of a reason why this couldn't be the case. And this one, among these that I've looked at, have a lot going for them. Maybe Paul's view has something going for it as well. The view that says, well, just don't try to figure it out. I'm sure God's got it sorted. Maybe there's something to recommend that view as well. Okay, so we can stop there and we can open it up. Yeah. We can go. So we'll go Amy, Molly, that gentleman, Bobby, this gentleman.
So this question is primarily for you. I think you can see too quickly for Howard that the Chinese room argument might work for the physicalist. I mean, I think the proper response is, I think, to say the functionalist has had their day in the 80s, it's died out now, there's better versions of physicalism that can account for thought, and here's why I'm worried about you letting in non-physical thinking or mental properties. If you said, well, it's okay, because I've got the physical, I'm a physical thing, and I've just, I've got these mental, which are non-physical thoughts. Now I want to know what the relationship between the physical me and these non-physical thoughts. They're not a part of me. And then you say, well, you're a haver of these certain thoughts. Okay, great. But I've got some sort of important interaction here, and all these mental things like the will look like they're not actually me or a part of me. They're outside of me in some worrisome sense. So I want to be in control of a will. It looks like I'm not. There's this external will that's not a part of me that I'm somehow related to. But if you give me the control over it that I want, it starts looking like I've got a picture in which I've got a non-physical part, which is, this mental stuff. And if you don't, if you start back away from that, then it looks like I've got something like thoughts as an epiphenomenal byproduct, or I've got, or the will, somehow I'm not free, or these sorts of cases.
Good. So the reason why I wasn't too worried about that stuff is that I've got a story about that, according to which all of our capacities are essentially embodied. So that's the sort of default view within the metaphysic that I'm working with, which is a hylomorphic metaphysic. And if the essential embodiment of every single one of our capacities isn't the case, we need a good argument that that's the case. The best arguments that have been advanced, they all riff on Aristotle's Daon 3-4, and I think that that's a really bad argument on any possible interpretation. So I think that, so because of that, I wasn't too worried about it. And frankly, the dimensions of that debate, and whether the Chinese room works or doesn't, or whether any of those arguments work or don't, it was just a little bit more on the technical side, and would have. That's the reason why I didn't. So like in real life, of course, we'd be talking more like in philosophical terms. We'd be talking more about this sort of thing. But for the sake of this, since I wanted us to focus on the the religiously thematic stuff, I just sort of said, okay, we'll stay focused. Is that good? Does that at least put it in perspective?
Yeah. I just think you still should just say anti-Chinese room. I think if you give him the non-physical thoughts, then I think you're in trouble.
Yeah, I think the Chinese room argument fails for well-rehearsed reasons. I think that the knowledge argument fails for well-rehearsed reasons. I'm not even a physicist, but I think that those arguments don't succeed in refuting physicalism. You want to say something? Yeah.
I'd like to know what Amy thinks the versions of physicalism that can accommodate thought properly are. I've not come across any of them really, but the other point that
I'm told that we need to stand over here so that the camera can.
Oh, right. You mean I've been off scene all the time?
No, I thought you were at that.
The other point you were making is something I strongly agree with. If you talk of something as being the subject of certain states or properties, there seems to be two senses to that expression. The ball can be red and round. It's the subject of those properties. It's the thing that owns those properties, the redness and round. Perhaps the body can, in something like that sense, have mental states attached to it. There's another sense of subject, which is a sign of subjectivity. You are the thing that is aware of these things. Now, what it means for something that's a body to be the conscious subject that's aware of these states, the center of it, I don't understand. It seems to me not to mean anything at all. So in that sense, I agree with you. I'd like to find out later on what of these physicist theories of thoughts that do better than the ones that Fodor thinks are working.
Okay, Molly, I think you were next.
So your argument for resurrection primarily depends upon the reconstruction.
You're talking to me or to Howard?
To you, Dr. Jaworski.
Oh.
Actually.
Well, I'm not arguing for resurrection.
Yeah. So.
I'm arguing just for the compatibility of that thesis with the thesis that we're human beings.
But for the idea that we are spiritual bodies rather than embodied spirits, right?
Okay, go ahead. Let me go.
So my question to you is, once you have the body based on the structure strategy or the physical surviving part strategy, what is it that reanimates the body specifically? I mean, once the body is created, yeah, we have the body, but what makes it alive?
Okay, so what distinguishes a living body from a non-living one?
They both have the exact same structure, both have that same surviving part.
Okay, so what I think makes, well, I was going to say that what makes the difference between a living thing and a non-living one has to do with the way these materials are organized or structured. So you have this dynamic set of structural relations among the parts. That's what's going to distinguish the living thing from the non-living one. It's not that there's some extra juice or something like this that the living things have and that the non-living ones don't. It's the organizational relations among these, and this is just what comes out of biology. That's not new. So in order to bring about the existence of a living being, God would have to will that some physical materials get structured human-wise or God-wise or whatever, and then you have the living thing. So that's just what distinguishes the living thing from the non-living one. But was there something more that has to do specifically with the resurrection angle?
No, not particularly. I was just, that was one of the things that kind of stuck out.
Okay, because the issue is then, so if God wills that there be this structured material, what makes it so that it's actually you and not just a duplicate of you? And that's where it's like, well, you either have a physical thing or you have this unique thing relation or something. Does that answer the question? Okay, this gentleman in the middle, I think, was next.
I have a clarification question about the gappy existence strategy. It seems that relations require relatas.
Yep.
And love is love of something, right? So in this case, what exactly are the relata? One terminus is God. The other one, what exactly is it? R doesn't say much. So what exactly is it?
Right, good. So that's actually why in the thing, because I figured that there would be a couple sharpshooters in the audience who thought, oh, well, if he's claiming it's a real relations actually have to have real relata. But in the case in which you cease to exist, there is no second relata. There's just God. So that's why it says the unique property R. Now, how could you work this out? You could work it out in the same way that people who believe in intentional states do. So you can be afraid of something in the sense that there really is something there, but you could also have this fear state and there's nothing there at the end of it. Your fear could be completely misguided. Likewise, you could have beliefs that are false. They aim at being true. Your belief is aimed at the world. It tries to be accurate, but it can fail. It can miss. That's what an intentional state is. So God, I would say, loves you. You are the object of God's intention. When God intends that things be, things actually are. Right? If you look at Genesis, when God says, let there be this, let there be that, those things are. Like when we say that, nothing much happens. But when God sort of does that, that makes a huge ontological difference. So God has these states of willing, and in the case where we exist, we're that target. It satisfies that intention. But of course, the tension can be the intention can remain unfilled, unsatisfied in the case in that period in which we don't exist. Does that answer your question?
Just one follow-up question.
Sure.
Fear is fear of something, even though that something is in your mind. What is in your mind is an